Good morning. And welcome back. It's been a little chilly and blistery here in Middle Tennessee the past few days. I hope you like my sock hat to keep my ears warm. Today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. It's something that can happen to your Harley Davidson engine. Now, it's something that can happen to not only a built engine, modified engine, but also to a stock engine. And this is something you may want to pay attention to because it's not widespread, but again, it is something that can happen. So if you want to hear about it, grab a cup of coffee and let's chat. Before we get started, I definitely want to stress, this is something that can happen, not only to stock engines, but also to built engines. Okay, if you remember, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about cylinder studs, and I think I had mentioned high tensile studs. I talked about potential for leaks and this and that with stock studs and the pros and cons and all that kind of stuff. If you didn't see it, maybe look back a couple of weeks and you'll see that video. One reason I wanted to make it is, again, this thing is something that can happen to stock or modified engines. If it happens to a modified engine, the builder is typically always to blame for it. But sometimes when you build these engines or you just go into these engines, there are things beyond the control of the builder. Not just myself, but whoever your chosen builder may be. It doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's relatively rare, but it can happen that you pull a cylinder stud from the case. Now, a lot of times the way that this can happen is that, the first thing that you will notice is sometimes you may have a base gasket leak. And of course, base gaskets get replaced or base O-rings get replaced, and in a short period of time that leak returns. Sometimes if that leak doesn't return and it's continuously ridden, that base gasket leak can then turn into a head gasket leak. Well, from there it can also potentially turn into a sumping issue. Because if a base gasket the seal is broken there around the oil drain, if you do have some crankcase pressure, sometimes that crankcase pressure could bleed into that drain hole through the cylinder and go back into the head and overpressurize the rocker box, potentially making a rocker box leak. There's a lot of daisy chain things that can happen when a stud pulls from an engine case. Now, when you build an engine, there are safeguards, if you will. There are things that can be done to try to eliminate the possibility of that being a problem when you build your engine. For example, I will take and put a spacer underneath the stud with a head bolt. I will torque that bolt down, dial indicator, look for stud stretch, and then walk away from it for a little while and come back and see if I can still maintain the torque on that stud. And then the second stage of that, when actually building the engine, fully torquing down the head bolts with oil on the threads and also oil on the shoulder of the bolt to get proper torque. So you come back and you torque that down. Wait a few minutes. You come back and check the torque again, see if it's still there. Maybe even wait overnight, come back again, check it, see if it's still there. But then you have the elements of heat and cylinder pressure and compression that's not giving you a full effect, but it at least gives you an idea that when you torque it down, if it holds the torque, the stud hasn't started pulling. The other is a very close inspection of the stud where it goes into the case. On stock studs, they have a shoulder. High tensile studs do not. And they're not torqued down, they're just spun into place. But on stock studs, you have a small flange, if you will, shoulder on that stud so that you torque it down into the case. And that kind of holds it. Well, some would say that it's always best practice to remove a stud and then replace them with fresh Loctite. But all too often, it is very difficult to remove the stock stud from the stock case. It can require several heat cycles, and it can require penetrating lubricants, things like that. And a lot of it largely depends on how hot that engine may have gotten in the past. It also depends on how much thread lock compound was used on that stud when it was installed at the factory, various different things. But here's one of the unknowns. If you have to apply an excessive amount of heat to that stud in order to remove it, and then a lot of torque to remove that stud, aren't you thereby also weakening the threads in the case? So there's this bit of a paradox where, as a builder, you kind of have to make a decision. You check as many things as you can check. You make sure, they will torque down. You do all of these things. Removing the stud and putting more Loctite in it isn't necessarily the solution because, again, you can weaken the threads in the process of removing that stud. Something to think about. Now, there is a procedure that can help mitigate that in the future. And essentially, when that engine case is done, you can install time certs in all 8 of the cylinder stud holes. And those time certs would hold better than what the stock configuration would. That is an added expense. And then the question of, do you really have to do that? Now, when I weigh these things out, the way that I look at it is every case, I'm inspecting. I'm looking to see if that stud has backed out any. I'm checking that torque, the spacer, this, that, the other, doing all these things to try to reduce the opportunity of that happening. If I see a tremendous amount of Loctite in there, or that stud isn't easily removed, then most of the time I will leave that factory stud in there. And so far, over all these years, it's been pretty successful, as I've only seen maybe 2 or 3 studs pull out of the case with, oh man, a very, very large number of engines we've built over the years. And the other reason for the video, kind of explain what can be done. Putting the time certs in is certainly an option for you. Can I tell you that you absolutely have to do it? No. But what I would say is, obviously, if I were building your case, found a stud that was questionable, you would get a phone call, and then we would time cert that one just in case, just to have an idea there. But basically, one of the things I want to tell you, if you do happen to find that you have a base gasket leak that just kind of starts out of nowhere, you can't automatically assume that just that base gasket or O-ring is the cause of the problem. If you blow a head gasket, you can't just assume that you just blew a head gasket. It's a wonderful, wonderful idea to check if those things happen, that you go back and you check the torque on your head bolts. And most often, I have found, in the few occasions I've seen it, most often when I see a base gasket leak or a blown head gasket, when I go back in and check those head bolt torques before I pull the engine apart, I find that there's 1 or 2 head bolts that are loose. It's very, very unusual for a head bolt to back off. Most of the time, it's because the stud has pulled out of the case a little bit. So when I find that head bolt that just feels loose, don't just torque it back down, because you're probably going to have a stud that's pulled from the case. And one easy way to inspect that without completely pulling the cylinder, yes, you have, you've pulled the rocker boxes, you've pulled the head off, is just raise that cylinder up just a little bit so that you can see the shoulder of the stud and where it meets the case. Look very closely at the distance between the shoulder and the case and compare it on all 8 studs. If you see one that's a little bit taller, that's an indication that that stud is pulling from the case. If you just tighten that stud back down, more than likely it will happen again, and you'll find yourself tearing it back down again. So if you see that shoulder moved a little bit, just go ahead and pull the thing down. Time cert that one. And then you have to make the decision, if it happened to one, does it happen to all of them? I will tell you, on the very few I've seen where a stud's pulled from the case, it is exceptionally rare that I see it on more than one. It's typically 1, maybe 2 that has started to pull. But then there's the question. If one's pulling, what's the condition of the rest? Is it a good idea to go ahead and tear the thing down completely, time cert all the holes, put it back together? Well, that's a question for you and that level of comfort that you require on your bike. Do you want to feel, hit the camera. Do you want to feel better that all of them have been done and you've reduced the opportunity for it to happen again? On all of them, then that's what you do, right? It's a decision that only you can make. But the reality of it is, this is something that can happen, whether the engine is stock, whether it's been built. And it's one of those things that can happen despite the best efforts of even the most attentive of builders who check those studs, check their placements, check the torque. It's one of those things that can happen. And it's beyond everyone's control. Mine as a builder, yours as a consumer. It's just one of those things. So guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope this helps you with your engine. And there's something I'd like to add. This will probably be my last video post for this year. I have to say, my heart's full. I've spent the past few days calling all of our customers that are on our backlog that have been waiting, and the guys that, you know, as we're cycling these bikes in and out and stuff, and I called everyone that's on the backlog, and I got to tell you, every single one, the level of patience and kindness, understanding, you know, it's absolutely filled my heart. And for those of you, I can't thank you enough. It's been quite a year, and so thank you to all of you guys, and for, again, your kindness, your candor, and all of you for following along with the channel. You know, there's been sporadic videos here and there and all over the place, but yet you guys hang in there with us and leave wonderful comments and stay engaged. And to all of you, I can't thank you enough. And whatever you celebrate this time of year, I want to wish you the best time that you could have with your family and friends. You know, for me, it's Christmas. So for my Christmas friends, Merry Christmas. And of course, Happy New Year. Happy Hanukkah to my Jewish friends, whether it's Kwanzaa or whatever it is that you do this time of year. I hope you have a great one. Thanks again, folks. We'll see you next year. Take care of yourselves and each other.